WSDC KW. In opening opposition, we have WSDC WA. In closing government, we have Sri KU Whipping Willow. In closing opposition, we have Alor Akar. My name is Willow. I'll be your chair. Paneling with me is Bevraj, Mubarak, Pakira, Prabhu, and Darshan. Right? No, I'm not. Okay, not Darshan. How much should I take? Just some friendly reminders. Please keep discussion to a minimum. Switch off the phone and enter and exit this room only between and after speeches. I'd like to call this out to order and on the motion. On the motion that this House believes the US should replace Saudi Arabia with Iran as its primary police, I like to call upon the Prime Minister to begin today's debate.
I'm supposed to use the mic.
Wait, can you hear this?
Yeah. Can I choose not to use the mic?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. This debate operates in the best interests of the USA in selecting partners in the Middle East because America is liable for the harm that their trade partner causes. So, the question now becomes, what will this debate be about? Firstly, given that Saudi Arabia and Iran are polar opposites in the Middle East, which side should the US support on moral grounds and on economical grounds? Side opposition will come up to you and claim as though lose the trade you have with Saudi Arabia, the US economy will eventually crumble. We are here to prove to you that that is not necessarily true. We are here to prove to you that there are different avenues that the US can find within Iran. A few things we need to clarify in today's debate. Firstly, the idea of why should America abandon Saudi Arabia and choose to side with the side of Iran. The to prove is why is Iran so beneficial to the US and how will they benefit from this kind of a proposal? Firstly, why should we abandon Saudi Arabia with Iran? So the situation in status quo is as follows. In the current political conflict in the Middle East, there's a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Because these two people are powerhouses of their own interpretation of the religion of Islam. Meaning to say that one of them is prioritizing the majority Shia and one of them is prioritizing the idea of Sunni. So in this war, a few things have already happened and a few things the US has already been complicit with because they have sided with the side of Saudi Arabia. In this war, the Shia have tried to take over Yemen and have occupied Yemen, which is a Sunni majority nation. So what happened is these people who have already large amounts of conflict with the people, with the nation that they have currently taken over, they cause massive amounts of oppression, they have caused massive amounts of harm. We are talking in situations where Shia people would happily choose to push away the Sunni majority within these states. We are talking about instances where neither of the two can get along, neither of the two will be willing to integrate with one another. So Saudi Arabia has used US funding to carry out a full-scale unrelenting intervention in Yemen. what happens is they bomb hospitals, they bomb schools, killing hundreds of people, torturing soldiers and killing them in brutal manners. This is the picture that we are painting to everybody in this hall. Side government propagates for the idea that we have to stop being complicit. Side government propagates for the idea that the US needs to break away from these moral hazards that they are currently siding with. So, no thank you. Furthermore, these attacks have been constantly going on in the idea of fighting the rebels in the current Yemen state. So what happens is this: because in status quo now, the US is at the disposal of the leverage Saudi Arabia currently has over the US because of their oil. However, we say that this is a legitimate trade-off, because the comparative is this: should the US stop being complicit with the idea of Saudi Arabia, constantly harping on the idea that Saudi Arabia is the source of their oil? Sure, we may concede to the fact that, yeah, maybe they might use an avenue of trade, maybe they might make an economical loss. We have to concede to the fact that there is a loss. However, we would rather lose money in this sense in cutting off a trade avenue, rather than losing money by funding a government that is complicit in destroying the innocent lives of individuals within certain nations. I will only take one.
On the first hand, you say that Shia is oppressing the Sunnis. So if you actually support this, Shia does it also mean you're also complicit of all those harm that you say here.
Okay, so that is not true. I will explain to you why. So let's move on. We need to stop being why do we need to stop being complicit to these horrible harms, right? So there's a social structure that occurs within this war. We have to concede to the fact that conservative people may choose to live in a conservative manner. This is what happens. But it is also true that certain people want to break away from this conservative manner by not being so conservative. So what happens in Saudi Arabia is, this is the problem. They have a structure that victimizes their opposition, the Shia. So they are also complicit with many different forms of harms. They are also complicit with the idea that ISIS runs. They are also complicit with the idea that they do not necessarily want to combat the growing ISIS threat that is rampant in Iraq. Saudi Arabia does not want to help in combating this threat, because it is not in their best interest to help the Shia community. Saudi Arabia is also complicit in trafficking oil. So ISIS vehicles are allowed to pass through Saudi Arabian oil. Because it is in the best interest of their state for the idea of economical benefit. It is the same situation in Qatar, where they fund the ISIS for their own economical interest. Saudi Arabia has done and considered into the same problem for their own economical benefit, disregarding the lives of many different individuals. So the next burden that we need to prove is, why do we need to side with Iran? The government of America needs to recognize the fact that there is in fact a nuclear deal between America and Iran. So it is important to maintain a cooperation within these two factors to lessen the radicalization within Iran, lessen the antagonization, and lessen the amount of hostility Iran places towards the government of America. So what happens when we support Iran is we become less complicit of the harms that Saudi Arabia brings up, and we become more and Iran will then will more likely become less hostile to the idea that America will be helping them. If side opposition wants to come up here and argue that there is a trade avenue that we are giving up, and that trade avenue is very, very important, we say that there are multiple different types of trade avenues we can find in the idea of siding with Iran. Because, okay, so this negates the idea of how Iran cannot necessarily provide as much benefit as Saudi Arabia to America. We have to concede to the fact that Iran is not a poor nation. We have to concede to the fact that there are many different types of possibilities and potential that the US government can derive from siding with Iran. So, what has opening government talked to you about in today's debate? We needed to prove two things, and we have done so. Firstly, is why we cannot be complicit to the harms that Saudi Arabia with Iran, a beneficial trade-off. An international harm that Saudi Arabia is currently causing, we are cutting them out permanently.
the leader of. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen and Mr. Speaker, this debate operates in the perspective of what's best for the United States of America, and in my speech I'm going to show to you why it's terrible for America to propose this policy and why it's better off we support Saudi Arabia, even if there are harms in doing so. But first, let me rebut some ideas coming from Prime Minister, right? First of all, they argued like how Shia individuals or like the Shiites try to occupy Yemen, where it's a Sunni country, right? And like the United States of America continuously funds the Sunnis, which like the Saudi Arabian retaliation, right? Then we would be complicit in the atrocity, right? But first of all, you have to understand, even they said that the conflict in Yemen started with the Shia individuals and the Shia militants attacking. So we don't think that the Sunnis are at fault in this kind of instance, defending for their lives. So what they would rather have is Yemen die and it's like US like doing nothing about it. But secondly, on the idea of state complicity and how we'll be complicit in the atrocities that Sunni militants carry out, or like Saudi Arabia carries out, right? We don't think this is like any different in their case, because funding Shia militants will also be complicit in the atrocities that the Shia militants are carrying out. So we don't see how it's any different. But finally, right, the third thing that they try to talk about is how, we are okay with the economy like being halved because on a scale that the economy will show to you why the economical harm of pulling out from Saudi Arabia is detrimentally harmful to the United States, and recovery is little to nothing, right? So, but first of all, most other rebuttals integrate into my substantives. But first of all, let's take a look at status quo. Like even they say, right? Iran right now is moving towards like moderation. They have closer ties to the United States of America, seeing with the recent nuclear deal, right, between US and Iran. How like US stopped sanctions towards Iran and how Iran stopped their nuclear activities, right? This shows how Iran is moving towards progression and like better like de-radicalization, even without them being the primary partner of like United States of America. So we don't think that the harms of like Shia being radical will like material, even though it's a slow process, it's still happening anyway. So moving on to my first substantive, right? Why should we maintain Saudi Arabia as a primary partner? We have to understand the role of the United States of America towards Saudi Arabia. We have to understand that the United States of America is the only check and balance that we have towards Saudi Arabia and their behavior. We have to understand also that Saudi Arabia right now is not really close with the United States of America, and Saudi Arabia are carrying out atrocious actions like executions in their state, right? What happens now if like United States of America cuts ties with Sunnis, cuts ties with Saudi Arabia and sides with their number one enemy, which are the Shia individuals, right? What happens now is that you create a situation between the United States and Saudi Arabia even worse. This means that like Saudi Arabia moves away from the United States of America and moves away from de-radicalization. You radicalize like Saudi Arabia even more. This means all the atrocities that they try to talk about, or like the Sunni atrocities, will become more harmful and will be amplified under their paradigm because of this like lack of cooperation between the two like parties. So what's the outcome? Number one, we think what happens under their paradigm is radicalist movements and radicalization of individuals and ideologies become even more rampant. We have to understand they already have a subtle anti-West mindset under them, inside of them, right? So what happens now is when the United States of America is actively funding their enemy, what happens is the the anti-West rhetoric or narrative that they have gets skewed even more. So you become even more anti-Western, right? And individuals who are these anti-Western people who want to push for anti-propaganda, anti-West propaganda, right? They can always use United States of America funding Iran as a silver bullet to say that the West supports Shia rather than Sunnis. So what happened now? You galvanize the Sunni majority to go against Western ideologies, specifically the United States of America. So we think it's not too far to understand. It's not too far to see these individuals are more likely now to cooperate with radicalist groups like ISIS, right? Who are actively fighting Shia individuals and who are actively propagating and forwarding anti-Shia rhetorics, right? So because the United States of America cannot help them fight against Shia, you will take this matter onto your own hands and more likely cooperate with more likely to cooperate with ISIS, right? But number two, what happens now is Sunni troops will no longer cooperate with the United States of America, and this is really problematic. The fight against ISIS is really the biggest role in fighting against ISIS and the Iraqi government. And the Iraqi government and these Sunni militants in Iraq fighting ISIS right now are Sunnis to begin with, right? So when you fuel this hatred that Sunnis have towards the West and United States of America, cooperation is less likely going to happen. So what happens when you hamper that form of cooperation? This means that Iraqi governments and Sunni militants will more likely not cooperate with the United States of America. Let's take a look at an example, right? When the Iraqi government tried to hire Shia militants to combat ISIS, military officers literally quitted and pulled out from the military, right? This shows how they are not going to support any individual who supports the Shia regime, right? So what happens now is, seeing that the United States is a supporter and a key supporter in the Shia movement, they are less likely going to cooperate with the United States of America. This is how on two levels. Number one, this means that Iraq can never military operations operate start from Iraq. A lot of our attacks towards ISIS, in which we have taken over places like Sinjar, Rabat, and Tikrit, ISIS territories, all started with operations starting in Iraq. And Iraq is the country that gives us key information in ISIS movements. So if we lose Iraq, if we lose the Sunnis, we lose the fight against ISIS, and we lose as America.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Stand against of certified government and call for the Deputy Prime Minister.
Side opposition seems to have a misconceived notion about who we are funding in today's world, who are carrying out these horrific acts and systematically victimizing innocent lives in today's debate. I'm going to ask three questions. A, are we still complicit in the harm? Because apparently the moment we fund one Shiite state, we're offending the entire culture of Sunni individuals and we're complicit in all the harms that happen. Secondly, what about the harms in Saudi Arabia? Are we really going to deter Sunni rebels away and Sunni soldiers away that do need our military and conscription and aid anyways? And thirdly, I'm going to talk about Iran, because as an anti-West sentiment can grow in Saudi Arabia, but it doesn't happen in Iran, but we strong arm them into taking our nuclear deal, right? So firstly, let's look at the complicity in the harms. The first thing that they told us, they were funding Shiite individuals, which by fiat means they were funding the oppression of individuals in Yemen. Here's the real debate, guys. How these Azadi rebels that on their own volition believe that they have a right to the Yemenis state and the Yemenis land on the ground. There is no connection between them and Iran and Iraq as Shiite states. Even if there was a connection, the level of complicity isn't as high as Saudi Arabia is perpetrating. That means in the end goal of opening opposition's argument, even if somehow Iran Iran is funding these Houthi rebels, they are not killing innocent civilians in Yemen in comparison to Saudi Arabia, which is, we will find a way to reclaim the land, Madam Chair, but funding Saudi Arabia isn't a way to end this conflict or even find some level of retribution to the homes and the loss of lives that this side of the house is complicit in. What did they tell us? They told us we're becoming more complicit in the harms of Saudi Arabia. Because one, they told us we're going to antagonize Saudi Arabia and move them anti-West sentiment, where things like executions, things like rejections of women's rights, and the oppression to the Shiite government are going to become far worse. How far worse can it really get? These are individuals that don't have basic rights. Unless you're going to kill an entire population, we don't see how individuals are likely going to live worse lives under this situation. But even in any situation, the leverage will always be with Saudi Arabia. That is why opening opposition cannot name a progression of Saudi Arabia from the point at which they were trade partners with the US. They still have executions. They still have a lot of districts in Saudi Arabia can't drive. Unless you can prove that US has some level of leverage and isn't dispensable. And the point at which you stop trading with them, they will trade with other countries. At the point at which you raise an issue with their government, they will stop funding you and they will stop giving you oil. We don't see the correlation and we don't see how opening opposition is going to solve these abuses. Walter told you a couple of things. He told you if we can't stop the human rights abuses, we will not be complicit in the human rights abuses that will happen. Every dollar that we pay to buy the Saudi Arabian oil is a dollar that is going to be pumped into racist law enforcement, that is going to prosecute Shiite citizens. It's every dollar that's going to be used to put a bullet in the guns that fire individuals in Yemen. We might not be able to fix the world and we might not be able to fix Saudi Arabia. We can reduce their firepower in harming individuals and we damn well can reduce our complicity in the harms that happen. Then they told us you'll become anti-Western. We agree. But the truth is, even if they're anti-Western and this is a silver bullet for garnering support to harm the West, it's unrealistic. We don't see how they're going to fund an attack on the West. But even if this is a means of gaining more support for funding Yemen, we already told you we delegitimize a lot of their harms anyways. The full-scale intervention that Saudi Arabia carried out in Yemen was legitimized by the US training, by the US recon, by the US troops that we provided them and gave them direct orders towards to harm individuals on the ground. The problem with Saudi Arabia is there's no accountability towards the army members. It's a monarchy that gives direct instructions to kill the rebel groups at all costs, even if it means you go through women, even if it means you go through children, even if it means you go through infrastructure that is important for a nation. So sure, they might become more anti-Western, they might try to reclaim back Yemen, but we won't be complicit in the harms that happen through this process. We won't give them money and give them a higher ability to kill more innocent lives. Even in its best case scenario, side opening government is perfectly fine with supporting Yemen and defending the situation that happens, hampering their ability to carry out these interventions under any situation. But this was quite funny, because they tried to tell us we could gain the silver bullet for trying to be so anti-West, but this can't happen in Iran. It can't happen in Iran when we strong-arm them into taking a nuclear deal after numerous sanctions that we forced them into. The truth is, the anti-West sentiment is far worse in Iran when they were told that they had a restriction of their ability to generate energy on the fact that they could harm other individuals in other parts of the nation. It's that Iran, under your paradigm, is going to radicalize because in their minds, the US is supporting the opposite faction that is complicit in all the harms that is happening in Yemen, regardless of whether we have a correlation. They are supporting the opposite faction that is complicit in increasing their ability to win this proxy war that US, that Iran, and Saudi Arabia is having. Sure.
If funding the Sunnis resulted in Shiites being radical, why wouldn't it happen in the converse where we fund Shiites?
So you see how money works, right? If you put money into Sunni rebels, they are likely going to harm the rest of individuals in Yemen. But if we fund Iran had no interest to carry out an intervention in Yemen. They haven't antagonized foreign nations. They had no ability and still have no ability because of the sanctions that we placed on them. Even if they say Iran is considered weak in the populace, considered a minority to a majority world of Islam that is Sunni in its high population. So we don't think they're going to hurt other countries. And even if, when we assume that we won't be complicit when the time comes then as well. Third question, what about Iran? Because opening opposition tried to tell us there's no problem in today's debate. Because apparently Iran is de-radicalizing. No, Iran isn't de-radicalizing. This is a justification for the rebel groups in your circumstance to take the fight and to push the political will for us to stray away from the obligations that we have towards the West, for us to stray away from the obligations that we have towards our nuclear deal. But Iran in general is still horrible status quo. Sorry, Berat. Was the Kurdish individuals on their borders, and they are not respectful with the land and the autonomous region that the Kurdish individuals have. They don't give them autonomy in comparison to other nations like Syria. They block these individuals out and they kill them at the borders of these nations. So if we're talking about complicity, we have a higher ability to regulate it in Iran because we damn well convinced them to get to that nuclear deal. We will convince them to not harm these individuals on these borders as well. Iran is not de-radicalizing, but if they were, you gave them any and every reason to not comply to the West. You gave them any and every reason, considering we've already strong-armed them into supporting our nuclear deal. What's for them to not leave this? What's for them to not harm more individuals under your situation? The conclusion is simple. Even if you buy everything opening opposition says, Saudi Arabia becomes more radical, assuming Iran still de-radicalizes. The conclusion of opening government is that we will not be complicit in any and every harm that Saudi Arabia causes to the world and to the Islamic population of this world.
Good. Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. And to end the opening half of today's debate, I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of House. Here.
Yes. Yes. Opening opposition believes that principle mechanical means nothing if at the end of the day more people will die. We agree that somehow we might be complicit for certain harms. We agree that we can't do anything about it. But this debate is about comparative. We agree that other side they might not be complicit of all those harms, but if they know that more harms happen under their world, then they are somehow complicit for all those harms. And we do feel this. Now, one, I will talk about the current context that we are debating. Because apparently, opening government does not know what is status quo. Status quo in Iran is not hostile towards USA. Why? For example, after the recent Iran election, they want individuals on the ground want to elect moderate individuals. That's why they elected Hassan al-Rohani before. That's why more women are in parliament currently. Why? This proves that Iran is currently moving towards moderation. That's why they strike the nuclear deal even when they were not the primary partner of the US. So it means we need to play hard to get for Iran to come to us, right? We cannot simply do anything for that to happen. And this is the case here. We think Iran needs US more than US needs Iran. But here as a bit Saudi more than Saudi needs US. In the first place, that's what we think. It's not pragmatic for them to say that we can completely abandon Iran, that we can completely abandon Saudi and get garner Iran support. We can garner Iran support under our side as well because they will need us more than we need them. But we cannot garner Saudi support because Saudi doesn't need us at all. They are the powerhouse of oil and they don't care about you. That's why we think it's something that that's why we think those right to use. So firstly, let's look at few rebuttals, right? They say, oh, the anti-Western movement in Iran will cause individuals to be radicalized. At first, I already disproved that it's not true. People are being more moderate. But let's look at the scale. If Sunnis are radicalized, they are more likely to join ISIS, which is something that's harmful. But Shia individuals, as far as they are radicalized, which extreme but not see, they will do a lot of things that harm individuals on the ground. That's the comparative that I want to make in this debate. So first, let's look at ISIS. Something that was not responded at all by the Deputy Prime Minister, right? We tell you the reason why it's important for us to garner Saudi support because of the dynamic of battle that happen currently in the Middle East. The way of how we combat ISIS is by support of Iraqi government. That's why about how we captured certain cities like Oslo before. I know that you can recapture again. But the point is, under those circumstances, we did that because we can launch a military operation from Iraq. In fact, in the current context now, when Russia is already in the battle, Russia is actually using Syria as the place where they want to actually harm the moderate troops. And if you don't, and the way of how you to counter that is by using Iraq as to counter Russia hegemony, right? So if you remove yourself from Iraq, if you remove the support of Iraq, there's no way for you to counter Russia that will kill every single moderate groups that are fighting ISIS. That's why it's completely bad currently on that now. Secondly, we think that suddenly we think that moving away towards Saudi Arabia means you are making every Sunni angry in this world. Why? Because for example, how like a crazy rhetoric or Mohammedan rhetoric that US is bad. Now you make it far worse at the doorstep of the house when you try to move away. When they will see when US will be seen as helping their number one enemy, which is HDR, which is completely worse. So under comparative, the way for us to actually fight against ISIS, when ISIS is constantly harping on the rhetoric that we want to kill all Shias, that we are the bastion of Sunnis, that we will help you fighting a Shia oppression, is by actually the way of our how to delegitimize it by not making Sunni people angry. At the end of the day, they will turn against you, and that's particularly bad. I will take one from opening now.
So we have Kurdish forces and the FSA, which aren't necessarily tied to any faction but even if Iraqi militants need our military support and our funding anyways to overthrow ISIS, why is all of this comparative to Saudi Arabia that allows ISIS to grow by providing them routes to sell their oil and become stronger?
No, I'm already told you why it's not true. In fact, Iraqi government does not want to cooperate with Shia at all. When they wanted to evacuate the city of Ramadi, and Iraqi government wanted to employ Shia militias, but military officers dropped out because they don't want to cooperate. So it means they are willing to sacrifice certain things, and as long as they don't cooperate with the number one enemy. So we also support like moderate groups like LSA, those things can also happen outside, right? Secondly, this second clarification I want to say is we don't think that outside we can still trade with Iran and we can also trade with Saudi Arabia. We don't want you to define the world where we can only trade with Iran and not trade with Saudi Arabia, and we don't know why that's the right thing. Secondly, let's talk about economy, right? Because they say, oh, Iran is not a poor country. Yes, I hope so, and I agree somehow, right? But we need to understand, before the sanction was made, Iran GDP was growing, not even reached by 1% at all. Why? Because we restricted the export, and yeah, maybe they are not poor, but people were so happy and they were like celebrating on the street when we lifted the sanction. And we thought it's so important for us to understand that Iran needs us more, and at the point in which we can also balance Iran's support, we can also trade with Saudi under those circumstances. It means the powerhouse of oil now is not Iran, but Saudi. At the point in which you enter Saudi, what Saudi will do is Saudi will try to screw you over. About how they did with the shale oil industry, right? They decreased the price so much until US shale oil industry suffered. So if this happens worse and your work when there's no way, when they have more reason to do so, and they feel like they shouldn't hold back. So if you want to ally yourself to Iran, they will screw you and even over at the same time. It means that Iran oil export won't be as much as beneficial under those circumstances, and also US oil export won't be as beneficial. I think that's one.
Yeah, so we can get oil from Latin American countries, like Latin American countries get from each other, or also domestic oil. But if the leverage is so high on Saudi Arabia against the US, why is there any incentive to reduce the abuses that you say are so harmful in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, because we tell you, let's look at the scale. At the scale, we don't make them angry, and that's a good thing, because oil make them angry, all the harm does happen. You understand why economy is important for you? Because in order for you to combat the ISIS, to conduct airstrike, these things need money in the first place. So if you reduce the amount of money that we have, then people are more likely to lobby against war. People are more reluctant to fight against ISIS. So it makes the fight against ISIS even harder. Because people will ask you to pull out troops from Middle East because our military budget is so big that we cannot try to afford it. So at least an hour we can reduce the harm is by saving is by not making them angry and screw us over with the oil monopoly, and we can actually conduct more express in more efficient manner. For all those reasons, we are happy.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for your speech. And to continue this debate, I call upon a member of our
By having a direct economical partnership with Saudi Arabia, you fund oppression, you fund all the human rights abuses which they have within their country. If you support Iran, you support a broken country, you support the funding of jobs, and you ultimately support the people at the end of the day towards side opposition. Now they try to talk to us about Iran if we actually meet them primary economic partner, if you actually make them a primary partner, that you fund the proxy war. Now, let's take a look at what realistically happens. Because Iran actually knows what it's like to really go through this sort of sanctions. Why would they even want to fund a proxy war in the first place? Because they know how to assess risk. Because they know how broken their economy is, why would they even take the risk of actually funding this war and risk another sanction which will hurt them in the long run even more? Because they know, because now we increase the risk of actually them being hurt in the long run. That is why they won't even actually think of even funding a war in the first place. Because such opposition says that Iran needs the Iran, that is how we actually gain leverage against them. That is how we actually prevent a proxy war from being funded in the first place. Now they try to talk to us about making Sunnis angry in the first place. Now we see that Sunnis are already angry at the US in the first place. So now even if we support the, let's say they magically support the opposition, how is it that angering more people is relevant in this debate? Because by supporting Saudi Arabia, you're directly supporting ISIS by actually because Saudi Arabia is directly providing financial aid to ISIS in the first place. This is the practical harms of supporting Saudi Arabia. But then why would opposition want to actually listen to that? Because they want to actually support the fact that maybe if you actually anger a few more people, make a few more people radicalized, we see that is extremely that's a big assumption, and we do not go with that. What is side closing government going to bring to today? Side closing government is going to bring to number one, why we bring light to these human rights abuses to Saudi Arabia, and number two, why Iran deserves this deal in the first place. Now, before I move on, closing.
The Gulf nations bloc, all primary partners and allies of Saudi Arabia, are the people that we are working together to fight ISIS. By alienating Saudi Arabia, you are alienating Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE. How are you going to help fight ISIS without these major partners?
Wait, repeat that.
When you alienate Saudi Arabia, you alienate Bahrain, UAE, Kuwait, all major partners in the fight against ISIS. So how, by you choosing Iran over economic benefits, do you not radicalize more Sunni nations?
We see that the benefits that come with actually not supporting Saudi Arabia gives us a political strong arm against Saudi Arabia, because they now cannot wave money on top of our heads and say that, look, if you do not agree with us, we will take away your funding. We take away the political capital that comes with making Saudi Arabia our primary partner. Now, moving on to human rights abuses within Saudi Arabia, I'm going to analyze this on 4 different levels. Number one, why partnership hinders our ability to criticize these sorts of countries. Number two, why there's no incentive for this change within these sorts of countries. Number three, why you hurt people on the ground. And number four, why you now take away the political capital to Saudi Arabia. On why partnership hinders our ability to actually criticize these sort of countries. Now look, if you actually make these people if you actually make these people our main trade partner, now they have a lot of money which is coming to our country. They actually contribute to a significant amount of our GDP. That is why what happens when we actually sit down and negotiate with them. If we even say something that's not favorable to them, they just say, "Oh, we'll take your money away." Why would you want to say that? If you actually do not agree with us, we'll take our trade away. We'll take the oil away from you. That is how these negotiations will actually go, because we depend on them, because of the inherent dependency we have towards these Saudi Arabian countries, because they have leverage against us. That is why we cannot openly criticize on issues such as women being oppressed within these countries, and why we cannot criticize on issues such as the prostitution of gays within these countries. On why there's no incentive for change. Because we are not able to openly criticize these sort of countries, either A, they don't even know what sort of abuses they have in the first place, or number two, they completely ignore the type of abuses they do. Now look, because we now actually have them as a main trade partner, and we do not criticize on these sorts of issues, there's no media coverage. We barely hear about the sort of abuses that happens within these countries, and they do not dominate the headlines of the news, simply because they are the main trade partner of us. Now, because of this, we're saying that, look, because of a business deal, we're going to ignore the people on the ground, because hey, that's just bad business for us to take away for us to actually not trade with them. No. Now, let me tell you on what happens to the people on the ground. Because Saudi Arabia is such an extremely conservative state, it's very rare for progression to happen within these countries. That's why, yes, we consider the fact that women have been given the right to vote, but then they're still not allowed to drive. No, they're still not allowed to actually be able to speak for themselves within parliament. And even their sons actually have even more power and even more say when it comes to, let's say, decisions concerning what happens to the women. And even 18% of the women are still unemployed within these countries. This is the sort of things that happens to these people if we completely ignore them. No. Now, we see that because of that, them being able to work is just a gesture and just a false facade for actually showing you that, hey, we can be progressive too, but then again, are we really progressive? Now, moving on to why we now take away political capital from these Saudi Arabia, we are not dependent upon these countries anymore. Now, let's say when it comes to issues such as taking refugees from Syria, we can say that, look, you have an obligation to take these people because of your proximity towards these countries, and you're fully capable of doing so. And because now what happens in status quo is that, oh, if you actually ask them to do anything for us, they can just say, oh, we're going to take money away from you. Once we actually take that out of the equation, we can now strong arm them into taking these refugees, and we directly benefit negotiations in the long run. Now, why do the people of Iran deserve this deal? Now, sanctions hurt people, let's face it, because the government is able to funnel all this money, all the money into the elites. That is why the people on the ground lose jobs. The people on the ground aren't able to even survive in this society. They're unable to put food on the table. Once we actually lift those sanctions and we stimulate the economy by directly trading with them, by buying their products, and by actually providing jobs for these people, this is how you actually improve the quality of life for the people on the ground. Compared to Saudi Arabia, which is funding the oppression within this country, which is actively using this money to harm the people on the ground, we see that the people do not deserve this because Iran is now going through change, because Iran is helping the people. Please side beside closing government.
Thank you, member of government, and continue this prayer for
That's about Iran as our major partner. This debate is about choosing between two major power blocks, the Sunni bloc and the Shia bloc. And this is what the government failed to understand. Because it's unrealistic for you to abandon Saudi Arabia, that somehow hope to keep Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, and the other Gulf nations, which has been that essential to your fight against ISIS or to your oil industry, on your side. Once you abandon Saudi Arabia, you abandon all of these nations, and that is the case that we haven't talked about. Few points of rebuttals before moving on to our extensions. Right? Number one, OJ came and talked to us about how, we are complicit in the harms that our trade partner does. We agree. But in the case of them, they are not changing anything. Because we have to understand that Iranians are not just involved in Yemen, which they are actively supporting the Houthi rebels. They are also sending Hezbollah fighters to Lebanon. They are also involved in Syria, helping the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. If you say that we are complicit in whatever our trade partner does, you are effectively complicit in Bashar al-Assad using chemical weapons to kill the citizens. No, thank you. You are effectively complicit in aiding the Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon to wage war against your major trade, which did not been addressed at all by Saudi government, and you're effectively complicit in funding Hamas, which is effectively against your major and closest ally in the Middle East, Israel. We're telling you that these are major harms not only to the United States of America, but to the power balance in the Middle East in general, right? Number two, they came out and talked to us about, what? Radicalization of Iran will happen if we do not do that. We don't see so. Because number one, the nuclear streak here did happen. Whether it's strong or not, it's an assumption by Saudi government which has never been proven. At the end of the day, we see that in the parliamentary election, clerics were voted out, moderates were voted in. Moderation is happening. Number two, we're telling you why it's much more likelier under your paradigm that Saudi Arabia gets radicalized. Because they came here and told you about how you're gonna make them angry. It's not just that. We're telling you that in this moment of time, where people in Saudi Arabia have been living under the cocoon of American protection for so long, they do not feel the need to be moderate. So effectively, Saudi Arabia is an ultra-conservative nation. When you and the risk of pissing off an ultra-conservative nation and the risk of an ultra-conservative nation radicalizing is much higher than a nation which has proven to be able to negotiate, a country that has proven proven to have moderation to act something here. We're not saying that we are not going to help Iran in any way. We are perfectly okay with lifting sanctions on Iran. We are perfectly okay with trading with Iran. The question is, on that one, no thank you. The question is, why are you proposing that we ditch Saudi Arabia for Iran? We are not actually saying that we should ditch Iran completely. We are perfectly okay with helping Iran. We're just saying that you should not ditch Saudi Arabia, you should not ditch the Gulf nations, and that is what the government doesn't understand. Before moving on, myself, sure.
Even though we're in Iran, we still carried out multiple operations from Iraq. So can you please stop assuming that one disagreement will outweigh the entire need to fight ISIS? Because even if we're against Iran, we still use Iraq to fight ISIS.
Well, your country, the United States invaded Iraq, and you have a permanent troop presence in Iraq. Troop presence in Kuwait. We're telling you it is completely different than when one country that you invaded and you launch operations from within is different from launching countries of an ally or someone that you are so actively alienating. That is different, right? Moving on to Afghanistan is about how more major harms not only to these two nations but to other nations, right? Because to the power balance in the Middle East. Because number one, some lack of analysis of side government regarding the question of Israel, right? Because we have to accept. The only reason Saudi Arabia isn't messing with Israel right now is because the trade relations with the United States of America. Once they start messing with Israel, the US has a certain form of leverage over and this is where the problem for the side opposition comes up. The government, especially when it comes up. It comes up and says, you know what? We understand that they might be harmed, but at least we're not complicit in it. We tell this is very irresponsible of you, especially as the United States, as the leader of the free nation, to simply say, you know what? Saudi Arabia is too hard of a nugget to handle. Let's throw it away and go for Iran, a slightly better nation. We tell you as the United States of America, especially as you are already complicit in so many harms that they are created, you are partially responsible, and you shouldn't just run away from the problem. You should solve the problem. You should help solve the problem. And by cutting all ties with the United States, you are not solving the problem in any way. And under your status quo, you're not changing anything because you're equally complicit in whatever war crimes, whatever war crimes the Hamas are causing Palestine, whatever war crimes that Hezbollah fighters are causing Lebanon and Syria, right? Now, next, on the question of Syria itself, right? What we're saying with this, what are we standing by siding with Iran, right? Because frankly, the United States line on Syria has been shifting on a lot. First of all, we said there's a red line of chemical weapons, and no. Then suddenly we said that Russia outside must go, and no. Then Russia comes in, and suddenly, let's just ceasefire. With this, you are further propagating the idea that you are ceding regional hegemony to Russia by saying that, you know what, Russia, you back Assad, right? So maybe we should too, because Saudi Arabia is already too difficult to handle. We say this is very troublesome and very problematic of side government, right? Because when you see regional hegemony to Russia, you disrupt the power balance in the Middle East. There's no more United States presence in the Middle East because Iran's ties with Russia are already much closer than whatever ties that you are trying to propagate in the first place. And when we tell you that when you see regional hegemony to Russia, whatever operations of the FSA or whatever rebels that you want to help in Russia, you have a principally inconsistent stance because on one hand, you are supporting the FSA, on the other hand, you are supporting Iranians who are helping Bashar al-Assad kill the FSAs. So where do you stand in the issue of Syria? Number two, on the issue of Israel. And this is what I find really appalling. It only comes out in CO. Because we have to understand that the Jewish lobby in the United States is massive. We have to understand that the United States of America will never ditch Israel. And in present case, when we talk about how you're going to be primary partners with Iran, which just launched a rocket saying death to all Israelis last week after lifting the nuclear sanctions. We tell you this is just ridiculous, right? The Israelis will be extremely angry, especially under now when Benjamin Netanyahu is already significantly unhappy with what Barack Obama is doing, but then you're going to alienate the Israelis more, you're going to radicalize the Israelis even more, and at the end of the day, whatever leverage that you currently hold over the Israelis will not hold in the long term. We're telling you for all of those reasons, for the stability of the Middle East, and with all due respect to Barack, I've never been on a swap.
Speech and any from government side, I call on government.
Speaker, how can it be fair? How can it be justified for the US government to send the message out to the world that we are okay with funding a government, with funding a state that is okay with funding terrorist groups like ISIS? How is it okay for the USA, the fighter, the leader of the Free Nation, to send out the message that we are okay with a country giving avenues to groups like ISIS to earn more money, to fund their terrorist groups against other minority groups, and to promote more racist issues? So we see that in today's debate, the previous speaker failed to tackle my members' points on how, by actually making Iran our primary partner, we are allowed to, number one, we are allowed to give back to the people, on the ground in Iran who were innocently harmed by the sanctions and who were the victims of a crime that was of their government, not of themselves. And number two, how they did not tackle the issue on how by doing so we can actively criticize the government and actively try to tackle more issues on human rights abuses. So, but before I move on to my questions, I'd like to reiterate what my member brought up. So he told you about how, number one, we can bring light to human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. We can make it more apparent, and we can the USA government can now actually make a change in the country. We can now actually make a change to that. We can give more rights to the women, give more rights to gays, and we can actually make the change by criticizing them instead of being by the leverage that Saudi Arabia holds above us. That the US government does not now have to be struck down by Saudi Arabia waving their money over us and do anything about it. And number two, how we can it gives the US government more political capital, because now, since Saudi Arabia since now Saudi Arabia does not their main trading partner anymore, USA is not obligated to buy oil from them. They can look for other avenues in order to get the oil that they need. Number one, they can just use the shale oil that they are currently producing in their own country. Or number two, go to other countries that also produce oil in America. So now that the Saudi Arabia, because they might not be damaged by the money that they lose from America, or as they are flooding the market with oil and trying to bring down the prices. But what they will be damaged is by losing the leverage and the power that they hold over the US government. By losing this power, they now need to seek more power in order to gain more influence in the political sphere. So what will happen is that now Saudi will have to listen to what we actually want, what we actually need, and so now we can effectively tackle any issues or any issues on the outside. But so now moving on to the main clashes in today's debate. The first one being about complacency, the second one about being about progression, and the third one on power and leverage. No, thank you. So firstly, we see that it is the issue of being complacent and the harms that come under their side are all hypothetical harms. However, we see that the benefits that this side can bring, and that by making Iran our trade partner, and the benefits that it can bring are tangible benefits, are benefits that will happen, are benefits that are not just predicted but will happen. So we see that under our side, we can actually promote and achieve more effective benefit when in the short term and in the long term, compared to their side, which is all just assumptions. So moving on to no, thank you. So moving on, we have the next clash, which is on the progression. So side government told us that how that for some reason, if we start trading with Iran, that suddenly all Sunnis or all those Muslims will suddenly become radicalized and suddenly start to follow ISIS and start to be radical people. However, we see that is not necessarily true. If we continue to fund Saudi Arabia, if we continue to not be able to criticize them on their issues, we see that we cannot bring any change. However, if we make Iran our trade partners, we can not only now criticize Saudi Arabia, but we stop funding Saudi. We stop sending the message that it's okay to fund ISIS and to give them avenues to earn money. But what's more is that
that by funding Iran, not necessarily everyone will become radicalized, and not necessarily everyone will become radicalized. So now yeah. So moving on to my third
Okay, if Iran is currently focusing on recovering their economy and fears the sanction, this means they will never radicalize under both sides. However, when it comes to Sunnis, if you pull out from Saudi Arabia, this will make the Sunni regime angry against the United States of America. Wouldn't that radicalize them?
You might radicalize them, but that does not. But the harms that come under yours, we can still tackle that under other ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to stay partners with Saudi Arabia in the fear that Sunnis will become radicalized. Well, we are still funding more ISIS. We are still funding more ISIS activities, and we are only propagating this problem. However, we see that under our side, we can take other avenues to tackle this problem while sending the message that it's okay to support ISIS. So on my third clash on power and leverage. So we see that as I've explained to you just now, when Saudi floods the market with oil in order to decrease the oil price. However, we see that they do this not in the aim of getting more money, but in the aim of getting more power. And we see that this now gives the leverage to the US government in order to tackle issues and to tackle issues and to negotiate with Saudi Arabia instead of not being able to talk to them, not being able to tackle any important issues that needs to be tackled under our side. So we see that the benefits that come under making Iran our main trade partner and stopping the president that funding ISIS is okay is much better. So therefore, side to side. So.
Thank you, Government Whip. And to end this debate, I'd like to call upon the opposition.
We regret the fact that true, in the status quo, we do have people joining ISIS. We do regret for many of these facts in the status quo. But at the end of the day, what the government is doing to solve this is absolutely nothing. All they are doing at the end of the day is just pissing off these nations by supporting their direct enemies and making the situation worse. At the end of the day, we see that the government brings more harm to the status quo, and that is why we believe that our side wins today's debate. In my speech today, I'm going to do things very simply. I'm going to be talking about a few things here, mainly the harms. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the different stakeholders which my member has already talked about, and secondly, I'm going to show you how our side actually caters for most of the areas and takes a big perspective in today's debate. First things first, let's talk about Yemen here, because this issue came up so many times over and over again. But what we are telling you is all the government's points about this is simply irrelevant, because when we talk about this, we see that, well, when Syria does commit war crimes, it is the US fault. But now when US is actually funding these rebel groups, it's also going to seem like their fault. So what we see here is you're not actually going to bring any change. All you're doing is changing sides in the war. So at the end of the day, where's your stand? You're not actually making any difference to the status quo. You're just changing your sides and still doing any harm. At the end of the day, you're denied. At the end of the day, your harms which you bring under that point are irrelevant because it still exists under your paradigm and under our paradigm. Moving on, when we talk, this was one part that was brought up that was not rebutted and not brought up much by both members of government, because we talked about highly that how these nations actually have a high influence on other nations. Now this is very important for you to understand, because as my member has already stated many times, that you're not just talking about two nations here, you're actually talking about a block of nations. And this is very important to remember, that the effects on these nations and the effects that these nations bring to the overall Middle East has a great effect. Now, what effects does it bring? Firstly, we believe that all the points brought up by especially opening government are irrelevant, because when they talk about how they want to influence Iran, we believe that it is also irrelevant because it still exists and it's irrelevant on the outside. And secondly, when they talk about how Saudi Arabia will become more radical, well, under your side, when you start to piss Saudi Arabia off and start to support Iran, they're going to become even more radical. We believe under their side, they only propagate more harm. They have not shown us how Saudi Arabia will actually become less radical. But all we are saying is that they're actually going to make it more radical. Tonight, sir. So this is how we find it very detrimental, because they have neglected the fact that how them changing and supporting Iran has such a big negative effect towards all these other countries, making Saudi Arabia more radical, making other countries radical. This has been dismissed by them and has not been talked by them. Therefore, we take their point. Denied, sir. Secondly, when we talk about the Gulf nations and the importance of outside, why do we see that under outside it is more important and the influence is more important under the countries which are for Saudi Arabia? Firstly, because we need to see that the point about ISIS was brought up many times, and we have to realize that this is very important. Because at the end of the day, how are we going to combat ISIS? We are going to combat ISIS especially by making sure that all these Gulf nations are for us. And we find it highly inconsistent under the denied side. We find it highly inconsistent under their side, because we find it inconsistent for Assad and how the US is actually against Assad. So the main problem with this is that they don't have a consistent stand in what the US is actually doing. People start to, there's two things here. One is a societal perception, and secondly, their stand here. Firstly, the US is not taking an active stance in who they want to support and the principles behind what they support. Secondly, what will people start to feel? What will these rebels start to see when US, which is funding these rebels against ISIS, starting to go for Iran, which is their enemy, against ISIS? We believe that this is highly towards the fight against ISIS, which is brought up by their side. Denied, sir. But at the end of the day, we also did talk about, my member also did talk about how it also affects the economy of these two nations. And the only response that comes from us is to tell you that how Saudi Arabia is very highly grounded in the US, especially giving oil. We find that once you take away this bond between Saudi Arabia and the US, we find it highly problematic, because now they'll start to, I don't know, go against US because of this strong ties. But that isn't the main problem here. The main problem is what closing government brought up to you, because they have also contradicted themselves when they start and talk about how the human rights and whatnot. Right, sir? When they talk about human rights and that whatnot, because they are talking about how well Saudi Arabia have lack of human rights, how Saudi Arabia that the women can't drive, so on. What we are saying is that this actually incentivizes the US more to go for Saudi Arabia, because the US has a moral responsibility to ensure that these nations know what they stand for. When people in Saudi Arabia start to see that what US principles and what US stands for are starting to take into account, these human rights will start to be enforced. We'll start to see liberalization in this country, because the effective influence, and we find is highly effective on our side when we support Saudi Arabia. Denied, sir. But then the second part about what closing government brought, we find it highly problematic. When they say about how we actually are not helping Iran's economy. Listen here, when you compare the human rights and about economy, we find it two very different things. Because when we're talking about human rights, the US has a moral responsibility, but we don't see why we can't still help the Iran's economy, even though when we're still with Saudi, because they have not shown us why we have to totally abandon Saudi Arabia and go for Iran just so that we can help Iran in their economy. We find it's highly problematic that they have not shown us why it's mutually exclusive, that they only help Iran's economy when we leave Saudi Arabia, when they've shown you all the so much more benefits of staying in Saudi Arabia. Denied, sir. Now moving on, what has closing opposition brought you that was so mutually exclusive? We have brought to you the fact of a biggest perspective of not only the effects on these two nations, but how these two nations actually have a large effect on a lot of aspects in these different nations which influence. We want to combat so many more problems than just these two nations, because we believe that we should look at a bigger picture. We brought you the fact of how it affects Iran and Saudi Arabia. We talked to you how it affects these countries that are affected by it. We talked to you how it affects the economies of these two countries. We talked to you how it actually bonds the ties between more countries. At the end of the day, we help more parties through our policy. We don't see why the outside is mutually exclusive to helping more parties. We bring more benefits than harm. Therefore, go for side closing opposition. Thank you.